I'll tell you what, some people really don't like crop factor. I mean, like, they seem offended by crop factor. Like crop factor snuck into the house on Christmas Eve and took a dump under the tree sort of level offended. I kid you not. Generally, whenever I do a video about a lens that's, say, an aps-c lens, and I say what the equivalent 35mm focal length is, there's people in the comment section who seem to be genuinely offended that we're using this equivalence term. But the problem there is that your focal length of a lens and the angle of view that it produces are different depending on the size of the sensor that you're dealing with. So for example, a video that I did most recently where I got a comment on was the Tamron 17-70 aps-c lens, where I said it was essentially the equivalent of a 25-105mm. Now I say that because that 17-70 mounted onto an aps-c camera gives you the same angle of view that a 25-105 would on a full frame setup. Now that is only relevant if you're comparing it up to something else on the 35mm spectrum. So for example, I have both a full frame and an aps-c camera, so it's handy to know sometimes what the equivalent focal lengths of different lenses are on my a6400 if I'm trying to match it up similar to what the a7 III looks like. And it's definitely handy to know and understand about crop factors and equivalent fields of view, because if I, for example, were to take a photo using my 11mm full frame lens on my full frame camera, I would get a ridiculously wide field of view. If somebody was to see that who's an aps-c shooter, they might think, oh, that was shot with an 11mm lens. Well, I've got a 10-18mm. I'm going to go and take the same sort of photo. And then they'd be wondering, why are they not able to get that same look of an image with their lens that's a millimeter wider, not realizing that actually their lens is only the equivalent of a 15 or a 16mm. And it's obviously not just full frame and aps-c, although that is the common argument that everyone gives. You've got obviously micro four thirds is a different crop factor altogether again. So some people might look at a micro four thirds system and think, Jesus, they've got an 8mm lens for that. Wow, that must be super wide, not realizing that you could get the same angle of view from a 10mm aps-c or a 16mm full frame lens. Or smartphones. Hell, if they were to quote physical focal length, people would think smartphones must be the widest angle of view that you could ever see, because they're all like 2 and 3mm focal lengths. And a 3mm focal length on a full frame camera, you'd basically be able to see yourself standing behind the camera taking the picture. The only way around not having the crop factor, the units of conversion, would be to have a way of measuring lenses that is uniform regardless of sensor size. And the only way to do that would be to quote the angles of view that the lens produces instead. So rather than a lens having a focal length of millimeters, you would say, you know, this wide angle lens produces a 110 degrees field of view, whereas this telephoto lens produces maybe only a 60 or 70 degree field of view. I don't know what the hell they are. But that's going to be a very complicated way to try and remember things. Everything that everyone currently knows about those measurements is going to go out the window. Your focal length, people also use to determine aperture ratios, so your aperture ratios are going to go skyward as well. So it's a hell of a big change for what is essentially just a frame of reference. If you're an aps-c shooter, you're only ever shooting with, you know, an aps-c camera, you're never comparing up your shots to other people's and trying to get similar looks that they have, then yeah, you're in your own little aps-c bubble and the crop factor becomes irrelevant. The angles of view become irrelevant because you don't need a frame of reference. It's simply a way of trying to make things more understandable for people. It's no different than in real life. How many times have you ever measured anything by the length of a football pitch? And yet we hear all these statistics of, you know, it's the length of so many football pitches, or this planet is the size of this many planets. It's just to give you a sense of scale and a sense of relatability as to what you're actually dealing with. So to remove that entirely would just make it too confusing for people. Even now, I see people who are confused by the whole difference between aps-c and full frame Like, I've lost count of how many people I've seen on photography forums talking about a new lens that they've bought that is actually an APS-C lens when they're shooting full frame and they haven't realized it's an APS-C lens because they didn't know there was a difference. Had that not been pointed out to them, they'd have thrown it straight on the camera would have switched to crop mode, they wouldn't have realized that they were shooting with a much narrower angle of view than they first thought. Or likewise, people buying full frame lenses for an APS-C camera because they think the full frame focal length is different to the APS-C focal length and they're going to somehow get a different field of view, and obviously that's not how that works. So I think it's always good to have that 35mm equivalency just to make things more relatable to people. And arguably it becomes even more relatable for people if you're then shooting compacts and bridge cameras and trying to get a sense of reference between them. Like a lot of people not realizing that the 8mm focal length of your compact camera is actually not as wide as most wide-angle lenses are on a full frame camera, or even most ultra-wides are on an APS-C. So while I accept to some people the whole equivalency is unnecessary to them, there are a lot of people out there that still need that full frame equivalency to get a sense of reference when it comes to dealing with different size sensors. And I don't think it's something that we should ever consider getting rid of unless somebody can come up with a more uniform way of measuring lenses across all systems that would be more consistent, but not being as complicated as trying to remember angles of view. But anyway, guys, those are my thoughts and opinions on the matter. What do you make of the whole equivalency thing? Are you okay with it, or does it bug the living shit out of you? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below while you're down there. If you haven't already and you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video. It's like crop fa- You fool. Just leave it there.